delts that I came across during my dissertation. I will start, or I will in general present, let's say 1.5 papers. The first one is the half paper that is on gender biases in sample definitions. And the second one is the one that Christina just mentioned that just has been published actually, where I suggest a new combination of methods to decompose gender gaps in a more life course sensitive way. All right, but let's start with the first paper on the gender biases and maybe also with a general note on why we should care about old age inequalities. I guess a lot of you know that lots of countries see population aging, so we have more and more individuals of older ages in our societies, and thus more and more individuals will face such old age inequalities in the future. So there's an increasing interest and relevance of these old age inequality questions. And what is also super nice, increasingly there's data available from surveys that actually focuses on the elderly population. This is, for example, HRS for the US, SHARE for most European countries, ELSA for England, CHARLES for China. And then they're even more harmonized through the Gateway to Global Aging data, really motivating also cross-country studies, which is super great. But the question is, to some extent, okay, but how do we define the sample of the elderly? Who are the elderly? And how do we find a sample definition that is meaningful across contexts, for example, country context, but also different subgroups? There are two popular sample definitions that have been applied in research. The first one is that studies include those individuals who self-identify with being retired. This is based on the employment status that is basically surveyed similarly across all these different surveys, and then this has been used for studies on life satisfaction, wealth, financial well-being, pension income, and so on among the elderly. The second one is pension receipt. So here studies include everyone in their sample who actually receives pensions, also for just studying different inequalities among the elderly. In this study, I argue that both sample criteria lead to gender biases as they exclude disproportionately women. I also show that this is linked to different work trajectories, maybe not so much today, and then reveal also the implications for quantifying gender inequalities in old age outcomes. In the first step, I simply show you country and gender specific shares for both pension receipt and employment status, and thereby kind of quantify the shares of men and women that were excluded by countries. And then secondly, I show the implications in this presentation only for pensions by country as well. For the second step, I use OLS regressions, but in general, this paper is extremely descriptive. Okay, I use data from SHARE, Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe, that covers most European countries. I merge waves to increase basically the number of countries and also have a broad distribution across different cohorts. The overall baseline sample includes everyone aged 65 or older. For looking at the implications, I have to exclude those individuals with missing data on pension income. And then I basically reproduce these two sample criteria that have been used. So the first one, self-reported retirement status, that is derived again from the self-assessed employment status. And I will actually show you the question in a second. And the second one is including basically everyone who receives pensions. And here I use the total imputed pension income that is actually generated by the SHARE team. This is then the sum of public, occupational, and private pensions. And lastly, to look at the implications very briefly, I look at also total imputed pension income. Here I include those who do not receive any pensions with a pension income of 0. All right. Maybe a little bit of background why looking at self-reported retirement might be a bit problematic. I argue that this is due to the gendered notion of retirement and also gendered life courses. So on one hand, pension systems operate based on a so to say, idealized male typical biography of continuous full-time employment as kind of like prototype life course, and then they link public pensions, but also more broadly private pensions, to stable paid employment. Here we see, for example, a very popular definition of retirement as the withdrawal of older workers from paid working life. However, this definition and notion of retirement does not necessarily capture the reality of individuals with more interrupted labor market experiences. These might be especially women, probably also other groups, but here I focus on women. And that is since we know that there are highly gendered work-life courses, and depending a bit on the country, but we know that there are lower shares of women with continuous full-time employment or employment careers. Also, literature has actually already highlighted in the early 90s that for women, there's a less clear pathway towards retirement, and in general, also more recent literature that retirement pathway, so basically how individuals enter retirement, is highly gendered as well. So some kind of like conclusions from this: meanings and experiences also of retirement are strongly gendered. And therefore, ambiguity about self-identifying with retirement is likely greater the more individuals' experiences diverge from this idealized male typical biography of continuous full-time employment. Therefore, those individuals who have those continuous full-time employment careers are much more likely to self-identify as retirees than other individuals, which might lead to this gender bias. And then, since we know that the level of gendered work-life courses differs across countries, there might be also really large country differences in this bias. All right, let's have a look at how self-reported retirement is being surveyed. Again, this is now the question from SHARE based on the current employment situation, which has been used for this. I think it's almost identical for HRS, for example, so most of these other surveys on the elderly. So the question is, which of the following best describes your current employment situation? Is it retired, employed or self-employed, unemployment, permanently sick or disabled, or whoopsie, homemaker? The problem now is that individuals have to decide for one of these categories, so there are no multiple responses allowed. And based on what I've just discussed in this male, let's say, notion of retirement and also gendered life courses, this is quite problematic. Also, given that actually really nicely qualitative research has put forward that housewives might never retire. This is actually a direct quote from one respondent in qualitative research. Okay, let's have a look at what this means. So here you basically see the self-reported employment status, here the different categories by different countries, the share for men among elderly 65 or older, so using this baseline sample here. So we see that most men in most countries age 65 or older do identify with retirement. So when they're asked, they say, yeah, I'm retired. There may be some outliers like here Israel, also Switzerland, Ireland, with quite high shares of men who still rather identify as being employed. But overall, most men would be included in our sample using self-reported retirement. Now let's have a look at how this looks for women. And here you see, we see a very, very different pattern. Depending on the country, for example, in Malta, up to 76% of women aged 65 or older would be excluded from our sample if we would use the sample definition. Also really large for Spain, Italy, Greece. And we see that most of these women then rather say, I'm a homemaker. That's the green part of the bar here, and not say, okay, I'm actually retired. We also see really clear country patterns here, so the kind of gender bias really differs across countries. We see the largest share of women that would be excluded in Southern European countries, followed by liberal and conservative countries, whereas this is almost not at all a problem, or to a much lower extent a problem in Nordic or socio-demographic and post-socialist countries. This kind of really is in line with the level of gendered life courses that we know from literature. Okay, very briefly, the same plot basically for pension receipt. So here again, gray are those individuals aged 65 or older that receive pensions, so that would be included in our sample, and green are those that would be dropped. Here we also see quite some high shares of men, partly that would be dropped, but again, the shares are mostly larger for women, even though the gendered sample bias is a bit of a lower level or less pronounced compared to using the self-reported retirement status. Then just one more additional plot, because I find this actually super interesting, is I looked at just the employment status only among those who actually receive pensions. We see again the same pattern here, or similar pattern for men, but we see that even women aged 65 or older who receive pensions, even among those, like up to 49% say, I'm actually a homemaker, I'm not retired. So this kind of really suggests, that the identification with retirement is much more strongly shaped by the distance to the ideal typical retirement transition, at least for these countries, than actually by pension receipt. Okay. Lastly, I just wanted to show really briefly the implications of this. Here I show this only for the gender pension gap and for selected countries. I can show this maybe in the discussion or later for more countries and also for more outcomes. But what we see here is basically the annual gender pension gap in absolute terms in different countries using the different sample definitions. The first one here, the black one, is the simple age cutoff, including everyone 65 or older. Gray is self-reported retirement, and blue is pension receipt. And what we see here in most countries, with the exception of Israel and Switzerland for different reasons, that we would largely underestimate the amount or the level of the gender pension gap if we would use self-reported retirement or pension receipt. Again, this is particularly large in countries where we would also exclude a lot of women, because, which I didn't show, but most of these women have done a lot of care work across their life course, have lower contributions, and therefore would be excluded from the sample. And this obviously has large implications on different dimensions of inequalities if the selective group of women is being excluded, as you can see here. Okay, let me quickly wrap up this first kind study. I do find and document a quite high gender bias in some countries. This is especially high for self-assessed retirement. And additionally, since we saw that this gender bias really differs across country, it also risks really skewing results in cross-country analysis, since then, the sample means really different things in these different countries. Women are excluded with particularly high shares of unpaid care work, which I didn't show. Also, men and women both with higher shares of experiences being disabled or sick or unemployed were also excluded or had higher risk of being excluded. So this really makes the sample quite selective. And then this obviously risks concealing the extent of inequalities, as I've shown here, gender pension inequalities in old age. I also see that there's a similar pattern for health and life satisfaction and gender gaps, though the level of underestimation is a bit lower there. Okay, so what could we do? One thing is obviously we could be a bit more inclusive with our sample concepts. Though they also still have to be targeted to the analysis aim. So sometimes it might be totally feasible to use a simple age cutoff and then maybe combine it with supplementary sample characteristics, like, for example, excluding individuals who are still employed, again, depending on our analysis aim. Then also a recent study, or actually data collection, has suggested to combine basically all these three simple sample criteria and basically define those as retired if they are not working and self-identify as being retired or receive pension payments or are age 65 or older. And if even that is not possible, then at least studies should be transparent about how they define the samples and what might be the implications of that. We could obviously also change the survey design, but I guess that's a bit harder to do. And then lastly, this has also implications for other variables and studies that are based on retirement status, for example, all the literature on retirement timing and pathways, because, for example, in the SHARE survey, the question on the retirement age is only asked to those who self-identify as retired. Yeah, so maybe that's important to keep in mind too. And lastly, obviously, other groups and group disparities are likely to be affected too, especially those groups that are also disadvantaged in the labor market. Again, I can kind of see this also for individuals with unemployment and sickness experiences, but it might be also the case for race, migration status, and other groups. Okay, that's it about the first paper, unless there are important clarification questions. I would go on with the second one, in which I quantify the role of relevant and gender exclusive life course experiences for gender pension gaps. So here I really focus on gender pension gaps from the beginning on, and this is because they are pretty high in most European countries, often largely exceeding the levels of the much more studied gender wage gaps. And also we know that women are at much higher risk of old age poverty compared to men in most European countries. Recent literature has really pinpointed that gender pension gaps emerge from, on one hand, gender life courses, and then on the other hand, pension policies that reward those life courses differently. Also in parallel, there's kind of like a dynamic across cohorts that we see that life courses become more and more complex, and this is especially the case for women. What do I mean with this? For example, that individuals experience more and more different events over the life course, more and more, for example, work or family transitions, and also that life courses are less standardized, so they also differ across individuals more, at least for some dimensions. And this has a couple of implications. The first one is that it puts quite some pressure on pension systems to adapt to those increasingly diverse life courses, but it also challenges the predictability of pensions based on only looking at full-time duration. I say a bit more about this in a second. And then also considering life course complexities becomes more and more important for evaluating policies, but also actually designing such. So when I talk about life courses, that might be a pretty big concept and can be actually measured in different ways. And I focus here on two, let's say, big perspectives or a way to measure them. The first one is to really focus on different aspects of life courses, for example, the duration of categories or states over the life course, but also the timing and ordering of events. And then there's another one that tries to have a more holistic perspective, but I say a bit more about this in a second. Basically, the literature on the gender pension gap can be divided across these two measures. The first one really focuses on this first perspective, and this is also the most common perspective on studying gender pension gaps, mostly focusing here though on the duration of states. And here even most often on the years, so the duration of employment or full-time employment, which is also super straightforward, but also not a surprise then that most studies find that gender differences in the duration of full-time employment is the main factor basically for gender pension gaps. But again, life courses could be more complex than just the duration in states. And this is kind of like addressed by this more holistic approach, where studies use sequence analysis to cluster together a similar life course into groups. And then those those groups basically embed several of these different life course aspects. So here the risk is a bit of concealing which specific aspects of life courses do actually play a role. So the basically what I suggest to the approach that I suggest kind of maybe brings together both perspectives and maybe thereby emerges a new one by first detecting actually, okay, which of these life course aspects are actually relevant predictors of pensions, and then decompose the gender pension gap based on these important variables or predictors of pensions. So now I talked a lot about these life course aspects. Let's try to understand a bit better what I mean with this. And here I brought you some example life courses as they are in my data actually work. Life courses here ranging from age 18 to age 65. And for each year by this color code, you see in which work life course state or category these individuals were. So let's start with the duration and states. The duration is simply the sum of, let's say, for example, here, full-time employment, this dark blue one here, across the observational period. And for example, if we focus on Herbert and George here, we could say that the years of full-time employment might be pretty good proxy to compare these two life courses. Herbert has longer duration of full-time employment than George. However, if we compare George's work-life course with those of Gisela and Agatha, we see that they have actually almost the same or even exactly the same duration of full-time employment. But we would probably say those are much more different from each other than the life courses from Herbert and George, right? Gisela and Agatha experience many more transitions and also many more, or at least some more life course events or categories that George and Herbert do not experience. So looking only at the duration and states risks simplifying those more complex life courses, and this might actually be gendered. This so-called steady working bias has been actually put forward by Orand, basically saying that it's a bias of looking only at careers as continuous long-term full-time employment and really risks concealing women's experiences or again also experiences of other groups. So what might be important is to look also at the order of events. With order of events, I mean, for example, there's a pattern here that part-time employment, this light blue one here, is always experienced after, directly after care work experiences, for example. But order here in the study also covers whether or not individuals have experienced, for example, care work or part-time employment at all in their life course, and also the number of periods they have experienced this. For example, Mary has experienced only one care work period, Agatha 2, and Hilda 3. This might all matter, first of all, directly for pensions, because we could argue that this might be a better proxy for stable employment, and stable employment might be really important for investing, for example, in private pensions, but also indirectly, for example, it might matter whether before the first care work experiences or unemployment experiences, individuals already had some full-time employment, which might shape the opportunity to re-enter the labor market. And then lastly, actually not lastly, but also importantly, timing also matters. This basically just covers, okay, when do individuals experience this transition or certain events? And this might matter directly, especially for retirement timing, for example, since in many pension systems, we have kind of penalties for early retirement and benefits for late retirement or the other way around. But also indirectly, really importantly, especially events that could be identified as turning points. So those that really shape opportunities afterwards, there it might be really important when they happen in the life course. So for example, here, we could say that the first care work experiences is a turning point, and it might matter whether one experiences this in the early life course or rather later. Okay, and now really the last one. It's basically a measure of overall complexity of life courses that measures stability by combining the number of transitions individuals experience, but also the overall uncertainty based on a statistical entropy. Okay, so that's maybe enough on the different life course aspects, but you can maybe imagine that if you want to include all these different aspects and then also apply them to all these different categories, we end up with a huge set of variables. And that's often challenging, first in our models, because there are just too many to include in one model. We might run into multicollinearity problems. But on the other hand, theoretically, we kind of like really want to look at these different aspects because they likely relate to our outcomes of interest through different mechanisms and thereby also different theories. So looking at these different mechanisms might also inform life course theories in the first place, since also often we argue, okay, life courses really matter, but it's often unclear, okay, which specific life course elements actually matter. And it's sometimes also hard theoretically to pinpoint which specific elements might matter. So for example, is it actually the order of events that matters? Is it the timing that matters? If it's the timing that matters, then when exactly and how should it be operationalized? That's basically what I want to come a bit closer to by answering the first research question, which is which work and family life course aspects are relevant predictors of pension income inequality. This I addressed with the life course feature selection that systematically identifies the most important life course determinants or predictors of pensions, and thereby also contributes to this theoretical kind of like debate which life course elements are actually important, though this depends obviously on the outcome also. And then the second research question is how these life course experiences are then actually associated with the gender pension gap. And for this, I apply the so-called Unequal decomposition. I decompose the gender pension gap based on those selected most important pension predictors. And there are two main benefits of the Unequal decomposition that I explain a bit more in a second. The one is that it allows, in combination with the life course feature selection, to quantify the role of gender exclusive life course experiences. And secondly, it kind of like addresses shortcoming of other decomposition, that is the lack of common support. So basically the lack of a counterfactual in both groups. And I argue that this is particularly important for life course research because we know that these are often segregated by groups and especially by gender in conservative country contexts. All right, very briefly, I look at two different countries, West Germany and the Netherlands. The reason for the country design is basically that both West Germany and Netherlands can be identified as very conservative welfare states, especially in the second half of the 20th century, with a really traditionally gendered division of labor. And therefore, I assume that we find similarly gendered life courses or life course aspects in both countries. But at the same time, they both have very, very different pension systems. So in West Germany, we have a Bismarckian pension system where public pensions are really strongly linked to employment and even earnings. Private pension coverage is pretty low. And in the Netherlands, almost all residents receive a quite generous flat rate basic public pension, but that is flanked with really high level of private, especially occupational pensions. So the idea here was to look to what extent I find similar associations of those similarly gendered life course aspects with gender pension gaps across these very, very different pension regimes or systems. Okay, the data I used comes again from the Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe. I use everyone age 65 or older, as discussed before, pretty in detail, but I exclude those that are really mainly employed. The outcome of interest here is pension income and then the gender gap therein. Here I focus again on total pensions, so public, occupational and private pensions, the sum thereof. But I really highlight here financial independence, and that's why I only include pension types that are based on individuals' own achievements. So I most importantly exclude survivor pensions, which rather increases the gender pension gap. I again include those with no pensions with a pension income of 0, but this is actually not so important for these two countries. Okay, and then the determinants of interest are the work and family life course aspects ranging from age 18 to 65. This comes from retrospective survey data. And we've already seen the categories for the working life courses. And then here are the different categories for family life courses. So basically partnership state and number of children. Okay, the analytical approach. The first step, again, is the life course feature selection, more or less recently suggested by Danilo Bolano and Matthias Studer. First, here I basically automatically extract the work and family life course aspects as variables. In this case, this covers duration, ordering, time, and complexity, so the life course aspects I've discussed. But you can even include some more or different operationalizations of these. This is again automatic in our package, so it's pretty straightforward. The outcome are then literally hundreds of variables. So the second step then is to apply a feature selection. Here I use the so-called Router algorithm. Again, the idea is to select the most important variables for our outcome. So here the pension predictors. The router is based on random forest. Some might have heard about this, so many decision trees. And the outcome is basically a rank of the variables by the importance for our outcome. That is actually similar to the random forest, but the cool thing about Router is that it also introduces a cutoff point, basically saying, okay, all the variables that do not have this, let's say, minimum importance, we just do not need to consider for our analysis. This is done by basically creating so-called shadow variables, so randomized versions of the original variables, and then the original variables have to compete against their shadows, so to say, and we only select those variables that perform better than the best performing shadow variable, so kind of like random noise variable. Okay, let's have finally a look at the first results. So here you see the variables that were selected as important for the Netherlands and West Germany. And no worries, you don't have to read these variable names. I will go a bit more into this in a second. I just wanted to highlight first by basically color coding here the different aspects, complexity, duration, ordering, and timing, that in both countries I identify variables from all different life course aspects that matter actually. In the Netherlands, maybe a bit less of timing is important, whereas in West Germany, it's quite nicely, almost equally distributed. Okay, but let's have a look a bit more closer to which variables actually matter. So actually, in both countries, I find that life course aspects related to care work are among the most important pension predictors. In the Netherlands, you can see here, duration of care work is the most important predictor of pensions, just followed by the duration of education. And in Germany, duration of care work is the second most important predictor of pensions. Here, duration of civil service is most important. And third and fourth most important are actually also the number of care work periods experienced over the life course and the age at the first care work experience over the life course. Now, interestingly, I find that the duration in full-time employment is much less important, especially so in the Netherlands, that it was basically just selected as being important at all. In West Germany, it's still among the top 10 pension predictors, but again, clearly less important compared to these care work variables. So obviously there are more interesting things going on here, like for example, the unpredictability of working life courses. So basically instability of working life courses is also quite important in the Netherlands. But I will go on now with the decomposition, and what I would do there is basically use stepwise models. So I start in both countries with using the first top pension predictors, because they're in both cases also much more important compared to the follow-ups, and then basically include more variables based on those ranks here. Okay, the decomposition. So most commonly in gender inequality studies, but I guess also other group inequality studies, the Kitagawa or Hacker-Blinder decomposition is used, which is essentially decomposition based on regressions that decomposes the gap of interest in an explained part, that is the part that is explainable by differences in characteristics, and an unexplained part that is not explainable by group differences in characteristics. However, as I said before, I apply this Unequal decomposition for two main reasons, and I go a bit more in detail here now. The first one is that a common critique of this, let's say, default KOB decomposition here is that it does not consider lack of common support across groups or here across gender. And what does that mean? That means that we might lack counterfactual of men who have the same combination of characteristics compared to some women in our data. And I argue that this is particularly relevant for life courses or life course aspects, since thinking back about our examples, we might assume, or we might even say we know, that there are many women with full-time employment careers overall, but several, for example, care work interruptions, but just no men. So we don't have any men as counterfactuals to compare those women's pensions with, right? And the Unequal decomposition kind of addresses this, whereas the KOB ignores that problem. And secondly, it quantifies a new inequality dimension, that is the part stemming from gender-exclusive life course experiences, again, in combination with the life course feature selection. That is basically the combination of life course aspects that only occur for one group and what role this plays. Very briefly, this is done by a non-parametric decomposition, actually, using one-to-many matching and then decomposing the gap in 4 parts. The first 2 parts here are essentially the same or similar parts to the KOB. So the composition is shared due to differences in characteristics and the one that is not explainable. But this is only estimated over the matched sample of groups. So only over the sample of men and women in our case that have a counterfactual for the characteristics, our life course aspects in the other group. And then we have these additional components here, the DA and DB components. These are the ones that basically quantify here the gender-exclusive life course experiences. DA by basically looking at, okay, in our case, pension income differences between those women who do not have male counterfactuals and those who do have, so those that are matchable. And then basically DB is the equivalent for men. Okay, let's have a look what this looks like in reality, the decomposition of the gender pension gap. So first of all, we see that these gender pension gaps reach really, really high levels in both countries, again, much higher than the gender wage gap. And then what you see here is the decomposition into these 4 parts for the stepwise models. Here you see in very, very tiny font the variables I included. And also we see the more variables we include, the lower is obviously the share of men and women we can match. So one first important finding is, let's focus on the green parts here. That is the explained part. So this part of the gap that is due to differences in characteristics, but only for those individuals that are matchable. And we see that it's not super large, but pretty consistent in West Germany, if we just forget about this last model here, and higher shares in the Netherlands, up to about 1/3. But what is striking is that these shares of the explained or compositional component are much, much lower compared to other decompositions of the gender pension gap that basically assumed common support across gender. And that is because we see here for both countries and across models a bit more consistently, maybe for West Germany, that really large shares are due to gender exclusive life course experiences. So basically to pension income differences across those that are matchable and not matchable. Again, let's zoom in a bit more into, okay, what does this mean? This is a parametric decomposition, so we cannot really decompose this variable by variable, but we still can have a look what drives these DA and DB components. So first, these DA components, so the light gray ones here, are due to the fact that unmatched women, so again, the women that do not have counterfactual in the men group, have lower pensions compared to those women who have who are actually matchable, who have similar characteristics to some men at least. And this is mostly driven by much longer and earlier care work spells of these unmatchable women. Indeed, I find largest pension penalties for those women who have the earliest or the longest care work experience. And again, the reason is why these are not matchable, that we just don't have a male counterpart for that level or almost for any care work engagement. Maybe I skip a little bit of this, but maybe what is also interesting for West Germany, I also find that these women that are not matchable are also those that have no direct transitions from full-time employment to retired or from civil service to retired. And we know from the other paper that this has a reason, right? Those women who do a lot of care work are just simply very unlikely to report themselves as being retired. Maybe just another way how this gender survey sample bias can unfold itself in our data. Okay, and then lastly, this blue part here comes up, especially important in the Netherlands, because those men without counterfactuals in the group of women have higher pensions than those men that are matchable. And this is for these cohorts mostly driven by these men, unmatched men, having much more years in education. So quite a selection here. Okay, maybe I also skipped this. This is in the paper, quantifies a bit more the effect here of duration or timing of care work for both countries. And let me slowly wrap up first. I obviously do some sensitivity analysis. The first one is that I apply alternative algorithms to the Baruta that are quite complementary. And here the results are rather robust. Obviously, some ranking of variables differs slightly, but especially this finding that care work aspects are more important than full-time employment aspects, and especially full-time employment duration really, really holds. Then, and this sadly didn't make it into the main manuscript because of the word count limits, but I also identify predictors of particularly gendered and gender-specific pension inequality, because what I've shown you was only the predictors of overall pensions, right? And there are actually also quite some interesting results, but this also at least made it to the appendix if you're interested in that. And then I also run some kind of like policy relevant robustness checks. Again, results are pretty robust. Oh yeah, sorry. Also, this predictors of gendered and gender-specific pension inequality highlighted again that particularly care work aspects are important for the gendered pension inequality. Okay, and then for the Newport decomposition, probably the most important robustness check is to relax the matching technique by using propensity score matching suggested by Sprengholz and Hamiedes. And doing this again, results stay pretty robust, with the exception of this DB component, this blue part, that the gender pension gap is driven by unmatchable men with high education. That is pretty reduced, relaxing the matching. Okay, conclusions. I would conclude that the combination of Newport decomposition with the life course feature selection works pretty nice for analyzing gender pension gaps, and maybe brings in a new perspective by quantifying, again, the part of the gap due to gender exclusive combinations of life course experiences, really highlighting those, and also offers a new perspective to approach gender inequalities in a more life course sensitive way. It prevents, to some extent, the steady worker bias of focusing mostly on employment duration or these stable employment careers. And I would argue that this is particularly crucial for future research, given the increasingly complex life courses. Also, this might not only be the case for research on the gender pension gaps, but also other gender inequalities. And obviously, might also not only apply to women, but also other groups, as said before, with lower likelihood of or chances of stable employment. Thus, this combination of methods might be easily extendable to other group-specific inequalities, especially for younger cohorts, might be interesting. And yeah, I skipped this. Just one note, I think also for intersectional inequalities, it might be super interesting to look at the role of distinct life course experiences. The benefit of using the Unequal decomposition on intersectional inequalities has been shown by this nice paper, actually, also for the German case. Okay, very briefly, substantive conclusion. The main finding is that it's not the lack of full-time employment that is the main reason for women's lower pensions, but it's actually the huge bulk of unpaid care work that is almost exclusively done by women and not at all or very low rewarded in the pension system. So the study really highlights the limited compensation of care work in both pension systems, also that life course experiences severely differ across gender and that we should consider this. And therefore also highlighting a bit the implications of gendered work-family life course opportunities that conservative welfare states shape. Okay, I think I will skip this because it's just a summary of both papers and open up the floor for discussion. Thanks again so much for having me.
Great, thanks, Carla. Let me stop the recording here.